Welcome to another episode of the ChrisRodMaxShow, the AI podcast, where every week we come together to talk about the latest developments in AI. We speak to amazing guests, whether from the founder side or from the industry side. We engage in interesting conversations, and I'm super, super happy to not only have Rod on the show today, but also Adi. Hi, Adi. Good to have you on the show.
Pleasure's mine.
Cool. Adi, we met basically over sake in an izakaya here in Singapore, and actually we're currently recording from Singapore. And today's session, we would love to talk a little bit more about the Asia developments here when it comes to AI. And obviously, I know you're currently with Deloitte. You are an AI leader. You have a background in AI, data, and analytics. Why don't you tell our audience what you did before and who you are?
Oh yeah, well, so I've played multiple roles in my career. I came to Singapore on the back of some research that I did, and then I was fortunate enough to be offered a teaching role at NUS, which is obviously extremely rewarding. The best way to learn is to teach, and then we were teaching everything which eventually became artificial intelligence. We just didn't know what to call it back in the day. I mean, the term artificial intelligence is not new, right? It's been coined in the Dartmouth conference by the legendary Professor John McCarthy, who also developed the list Turing knowledge. It was coined back in 1956. We just didn't know that what we were teaching at NUS was to become what now is known as in the mainstream as artificial intelligence. So we were teaching everything from new media and sentiment mining, machine translation, which automatically now rings the bell. Generative AI has all got its genesis in machine translation, right? We taught computational intelligence. We called it knowledge engineering, which are all now starts to make sense as how we view AI, but we just didn't call it AI. So about 5, 6 years ago, NUS launched this course in Masters in Artificial Intelligence. But so the stuff that we created there was a precursor to all of that. Now I then worked for BCG. I helped co-found what is now BCGX, and that I did that in the region. I worked for a company called Data Robot, which is essentially we created the category of auto ML, which is automated machine learning, and ML ops, which is machine learning operations, now very, very relevant in today's day and age. And it is the reason why I met Chris Shiveen, who's a good mutual friend of ours, was the reason why I was invited to the Sake Due in the first place. And now, of course, I now run the artificial intelligence business for Monitor Deloitte in Southeast Asia. It's a great time to be a consultant now because, it's the sweet spot of consulting where everyone wants to do something, no one really knows how to do it, and therefore they look for advice. So it's an interesting time to be a consultant right now. I'm happy to talk about how enterprises are adopting AI, what the state of enterprise is, what are the bright shiny new toys on the block, and how must one deal with the onslaught of what we are facing here in APAC and more broadly the world.
Awesome, Adi. I think you're really the expert for our show today.
I pretend to be, and the companies who employ me, they pretend to pay me.
Of course, basically, we're all trying to figure out the future at this point in time. But listen, we usually talk a lot about the developments we see in the US. It's always US versus China. We talk also a lot about how Europe is sort of like going another way of coming up with an AI act, being a little bit more prudent. We had a couple of, let's say hopes, for example, the German LLM model, Aleph Alpha, all these different models. Tell us a little bit more. What is your feeling for maybe Southeast Asia, Singapore? Share a little bit of color of let's say, the development of AI in general here in the region. What do people use here? Is it more the US based models, more the Chinese ones? What's your take on that?
So when you say people, are you talking about like large enterprises? What they are preferring companies, right? Okay. Well, I think that is a very profound question, and as a conscientious consultant, I am forced to say it depends. But I think so there's a wide splattering of people using a large variety of LLMs, right? It all started off by companies sort of white labeling large language models provided by the premier companies who started it all, like OpenAI, right? And then calling it Chat PWC or DBS GPT or things like that. So they were just white labeling, buying enterprise grade APIs from OpenAI, licensing it, and then white labeling it and rolling it out. That's how it all got started. Then there was this sputtering of co-pilots from Microsoft co-pilots who were MS users, or AWS queues from who are like have large committed spend on AWS, right? So they started using co-pilots, which were these point solutions. But as we see that enterprises, especially those who are a little further on in their journey, they are beginning to realize that it's not really a one size fits all, but you have to adopt a horses for courses kind of an approach right now. So, I mean, I have always maintained with my customers that, in today's date, large language models are becoming lighter, etc. Right? So the future is not far away where LLMs are neither going to be large nor going to be language dependent, right? So we're all seeing small language models, we're all seeing LLMs being able to interact with multiple types of languages, images, videos, etc. Right? So the language is no longer a constraint, large or the size is no longer a constraint. So what you're going to see is just models, right? The only difference is, and this is not too far away from what traditional machine learning was, right? Traditional machine learning was also just models. We used to always talk about ML models, right? And therefore you had companies like Data Robot, which could make different models compete with each other in this competitive learning paradigm, and then train them in a way in which the ones which are most accurate, they bubble up to the top, and that's the one you put into production. That's the one you use for decisioning. So machine learning has always been treating models, right? LLMs for a brief while provided this sort of a horizontal interface where there was no longer a one-to-one mapping between a use case and a model, because this one LLM could now be used for multiple use cases, right? Although with varying degrees of accuracy. So as models start to become more open source, more lighter, more accurate, right, and not only language dependent, you're just going to see a sort of a proliferation of small, open source, lightweight, maybe pre-trained in most cases, of course, but then fine-tuned to suit a particular purpose, right? So we are going to see that convergence towards the old machine learning school of thought, where now the one-to-one mapping between a use case and a model is starting to going to come back into fashion. So the companies who are becoming more and more advanced have a large presence of Gen AI in their operations, and they've moved on from just this co-pilot business to true workforce workflow transformation. They are beginning to adopt a wide variety of models, not just ChatGPT, not just uh, Quen 3, which was released by Alibaba recently, or not just cloud, but a lot of open source stuff, a lot of small language models downloaded from Hugging Face, websites and other sources, and then deployed nearby. What they're trying to essentially achieve is sort of the panacea of what AI practitioners have been always wanting to achieve, which is train close to the data, inference close to the user, right? Therefore, at inference time, you're reducing your latency and so on and so forth. It's now becoming possible because of that. So there is no one answer of which LLMs are becoming popular. The answer is very dependent upon the maturity of the organization. The highly mature ones are starting to move towards a horses for courses approach. It depends upon what business problem you're trying to solve and what fits that particular business problem. Those who are less mature, they are white labeling chat GPTs of the world, they're white labeling clouds of the world, rolling it out as the first instance, slowly moving to the co-pilot type solution, then RAG, and then to this sort of a plethora of models, right? But Asia, Rod, I can. talk about it for hours. So please stop me at this.
No, I wanted here to go back to a point you said earlier that we're moving to models, right? So not anymore neither language, not large, and so on. And you were saying there are some parallels here with how it was, for example, when you were a data robot. But here's something that I observed, and you can correct me if you're seeing it differently. It is that back then, when there was data robot and all these companies that were enabling enterprises to roll out machine learning, was happening. It was first. All this was very obscure knowledge, right? So it was not possible. So for anyone, a company to get things done, there needs to be here so the real expertise to these models. They need to be trained with the data of the company, right? So there needs to be all this processing, preparing the data, have it ready, and so on. And the third one, it was that this was very uh, so tightly coupled to the data itself. So you say, okay, I prepare a model that works for my, let's say, customer service in one of my, so for example, subsidiaries, and that's it. I cannot use this model for even like customer service in another subsidiary in a different country. You have to be again from the same, start from scratch. And now you don't have any of that, right? And now pretty much any developer, or not even developer, any, so let's say like semi-technical person can go create just an API with the open AI and then start doing things. And these things on top, they can be used for across functions and verticals and also subsidiaries in the organization. So here, what will you say that is happening in terms of what is, let's say, how it was and how it is now? So do you think similar or is different?
Great, Rod. I mean, it's a very good observation, right? So as I said, generative AI turned AI as we knew it on its head for many, many reasons. The first thing it did was that it really truly democratized AI. Truly, truly democratized AI. My mother is right now on ChatGPT, right? Doing some. She has never been more proud of me, right? She was earlier, she had no clue I was doing some machine learning AI. And now she's like, my God, you're an AI, right? So the first thing that was very, very transformational was that it truly, the accessibility that ChatGPT particularly provided the users, it truly democratized AI. Data Robot, you mentioned, Data Robot was founded on the premise of democratization. It says that let us take away the burden of lengthy coding and codify or put all of that into a platform which you could then use for machine learning training, right? So, but truly, the fundamental step was when ChatGPT was released was true democratization. The second thing which changed as a result of the democratization was, as I was mentioning, there was no longer a one-to-one mapping between a use case and a model, right? In the old machine learning way, if you are looking to solve for a probability of default model, which predicts the probability whether you're going to default on a loan, that model, as you were rightly mentioning, Rod, is fundamentally tied to that use case. Even if you shift one parameter on it, that is, if you want to predict the probability of default for a customer in another region or another segment, you'll have to retrain that model on a different set of data if the data is different, right? That was the second change. So for now, these models were large enough to cater to a certain type of use case, right? But what is now starting to happen is people are beginning to realize that the accuracy which is needed to get the same response from these generative AI models over and over and over again. And for things like it has to adhere to certain responsible AI guidelines, it has to adhere to certain brand principles if it is touching your customers, it has to adhere to a certain amount of intelligence quotients, etc., etc. As these new guidelines start to emerge, people are starting to realize that we don't have the luxury of using the same model as it is for multiple use cases. You will have to do some kind of customization. The first type of customization which happened was retrieval augmented generation, right? When we said that, all right, we are going to point the model to a particular type of curated data set, and the model is only going to give me responses from that part of the curated data set. That was the first level of customization. We are quickly reaching the ends of that particular technology, right? As I was mentioning, you still have to find a way, if you want to have more contextual, accurate responses, to be able to train the model on that or custom fine tune it, not build it from scratch, but fine tune it on the data which is meant for that particular use case, moving away from RAG. So in that manner, we are going to see similarity between the old school machine learning and the new way of looking at models when they become less and less language and size dependent. What is different though, Rod, is that you're going to see, and I have been saying this for many years, even in the old machine learning way, and it is a controversial statement that I'm going to make, and many people, including like old school data scientists, are going to disagree with me. But the dependency on good quality data is going to be reducing. We have already seen that in the old machine learning way. In the new way of the models being able to produce these contextual responses, it couldn't have been more true. And let me explain the two things, right? The old way and the new way. In the old way, when we were doing predictions using statistical models, like logistic regression, for example, you had to really, really curate your data in a manner in which it would fit the assumptions laid out by the model of logistic regression. And there were many assumptions. We can go and get into the technicality if your users are interested. I'm sure they are not, right? Sure they're not. But as the models progressed, you entered into neural networks, tree-based models, ensemble models like random forest and XGBoost. You didn't have to put in as much effort in curating the data as you'd had to do for logistic regression, right? Already there was less dependence on good quality data. In this new world right now, there is going to be even less dependence on good quality data because of something called transfer learning, right? If you look at the learning curves of, say, GPT 3.5, I'm not even looking at the latest models. Right? Go back to GPT 3.5. Look at the learning curves of GPT 3.5, right? It was starting to be trained on vast swaths of literature, language-based data, right? But as it started to become more and more accurate in solving language type problems, people started to notice that its ability to solve for quant type problems was also becoming more and more popular or more and more accurate. And it had never been trained on that type of data. This paradigm is called transfer learning. The ability of the model to, become better, smarter at something it was never trained on. That is going to become more and more popular, and therefore the dependence on good quality data is going to be further going down, right? Although it is still important, but not to the extent it was in the machine learning world.
And Adi, thank you so much for this excursion. Let me just summarize what I'm hearing, and just coming back to the state of enterprise AI. So basically, the first point you're making is to say, okay, it's really not dependent on the model. There's an emergence of like using models for multiple use cases. I think the second one you're saying is inherently Gen AI today is obviously a very different type of, let's say, back end or like under the hood than maybe in the previous traditional machine learning models, where it was all about like setting up the parameters, having like training data to train the models, whereby here in this case basically the AI learns itself. And I think the best example I can give is really Alpha Zero learning chess, and basically just learning chess through knowing the rules and playing it itself for like millions of times and learning the rules there. Whilst the old model, Stockfish, which is still a very powerful machine learning tool in chess, learned by looking at all the games that have been played between grandmasters and learned with that. So that's, I think, just to make it a little bit more visual for our audience. But I think this is very interesting what you're saying. And you're also saying that data will not be the key, which I do believe is controversial, because I think lots of companies rely on their data and data cleaning and making sure that the data is somewhat usable.
Yeah, maybe I will just try to caveat that before I start to lose my job, right?
And before we get that, so Hiradi, I wanted just to like connect that into this following, because you're saying it's a great time for consultants. But I'm wondering here, for example, we say data will not be that relevant anymore. And we're saying the models, pretty much anyone can use it and so on. Then what's the role that consultants here play in all this?
So two things I would like to say just off the bat, right? Chris, data is still important, right? Organizations still have to reach a base level of data quality, data governance, data management, etc., etc. Data risk management. It's still extremely critical for them to be able to manage risk when it comes to bad quality data, regulatory risk, compliance, and so on. It's critical. right? What I'm trying to say is there is not, in going forward, the way the models are progressing, you wouldn't have to do a huge amount of data prep for either data quality issues or for feature engineering type issues to be able to create an accurate enough model as you would have in that's the caveat there, right? The dependency on extremely great quality data is going to reduce further. It's extremely important that you hire the right consultant to get you to that base level of data quality as an enterprise. Now, the role of the consultants, right? There is a huge role for the consultants to play at this stage, right? And that is to be able to figure out the horses for courses policy, right? It is critical for organizations to have the right AI strategy, right? Which is essentially a strategy. AI strategy, essentially two things, isn't it? It is what are you going to solve with AI, which is a roadmap of use cases, and and the capabilities. How are you going to solve it, right? Either the people capabilities or the tech capabilities. What should you invest in right now, and what should you how you should monitor it, right? So the organizations have to get their AI strategy right, which all starts with having, of course, a North Star. I mean, I'm talking to strategy consultants like Chris, probably, or who have worked for strategy consultants in the past. You have to set that and you have to distill it down so that it becomes a part of your enterprise rhythm. That is a big role that consultants have to play because consultants can bring that outside in perspective. They can be great facilitators. They can break down the barriers which internal organizations may have. They are able to then advise on how to set this whole thing up so that your total cost of ownership of your AI program is optimized and you're receiving an ROI, which is clear, right? The second role that consultants have to play is is closely related to AI governance, right? Organizations, especially the ones who are starting to use AI in a big manner, they are going to have a need to protect themselves from the adverse effects of AI, which exist out there, right? So there needs to have a consultant who comes in and sets up the whole AI governance framework and sets the organization up for success. And I know you guys have probably a thing or two to add about that. I'm probably taking up too much of your airtime, but stop me whenever you find that there is something which.
We stop you here and again ask, seeing so many clients, seeing so many companies, what is your impression on APAC enterprises when it comes to AI adoption?
Yeah, I mean it's a splattering of about three or four different types of sort of personas that we see in the enterprise space, right? There are about 30 to 40% are still experimenting a lot. They are stuck in what we like to call POC purgatory, right? That's POC hell. That you're just experimenting. You're not able to put anything into production. Therefore, you're not achieving any value out of it. So there are isolated POCs which are running. There are these shadow IT co-pilot trials which are running across your organization. So very much in the experimenting phase. Right? Then you come to sort of these early scalers. You have some Gen AI chatbots in production. You have your first retrieval augmented generation pilots just coming through. You have your in the governance space, you have some basic sort of model risk policies that you have drafted. You have some AI governance standards policies, frameworks that you're starting to put out. You have some LLM ops rules uh, that you are starting to sort of technically implement in your LLM ops platform. Those are the early scalers. Then you have these sort of companies like DBS, for example, right? Great example, which are like who have integrated AI strategically, right? So they have obviously hired a great consultant like Deloitte, who have written a nice AI strategy for them, who have designed a cross-functional AI COE, who have done some form of workflow redesign. They have basically moved on from co-pilots into fundamentally re-engineering their workflows with AI, right? So that Piyush Gupta can stand up and say that we are having a reduction of augmented workforce of a couple of thousand just before he retired, right? So these are the strategic sort of integrators of AI. That's the third persona. Then the last one is very much a subset of this third persona, which are now starting to put some sort of multi-agent systems in the workflow, right? To transform the workflow. And one agent hands it off to the other ones, and you have these multi-agentic chains, etc. They're starting to have some kind of sovereign cloud LLMs type deals with their hyperscalers, or they are, their other enterprise architecture providers, and they have a CEO level AI governance and quantified ROI for AI. Again, DBS is a great example, right? In that quantified ROI space, very interesting conversations that we are having is if you want to assetize your AI in your balance sheet, right, as an intangible asset, which will just be a line as an asset on your balance sheet without you having done anything but put AI models into production. So these kind of conversations are having in the very, very sophisticated part.
So basically, you're saying 50% is still basically trying out a couple of use cases here and there in pilots. Then how many of the other ones would you?
Yeah, I think about 40% are the experimenters, right? Then you have about another 40% who have put some form of chatbot in production, either internal or external. They've experimented with some RAG solutions, and they have some basic model policies. That's about 40%. About 20% are these sort of strategic integrators, right, who have set up a cross-functional AI COE, have done some workflow redesign, KPI linked funding, all that stuff, right? And about 5%, maybe 7%, are the ones who are putting multi-agent systems in place, who have an enterprise-wide ROI framework, and about 0.5%, if you may, are starting to think about how to assetize AI on the balance sheet, right? So that's roughly the distribution.
I just want to say here, if you have maybe like some proxies, some comparison with other regions in the world. So would you say that APAC is ahead of everyone else, or is maybe lagging behind, or just like everyone else? Where will you see the region in relation with the rest of the world?
I would say, I mean, so obviously we have a global network and I have exposure to what the clients globally are doing. When it comes to focus on value, I believe, right? I think the APAC firms are a bit ahead on terms of show me the value of AI. So much so that they may not have put anything into production yet, but they're still thinking of ROI, right? But I believe that when it comes to actual workflow redesign, which I think is the most sophisticated, uh, you know, persona who actually is using AI for workflow redesign, these fundamental how your business functions, and then you redesign that workflow, right? In that aspect, the West is further ahead from us, which is basically the US is obviously very far ahead of us on an average across industries, right? We can get into industry-based personas as well, but on an average, the US is very far ahead of us. I think some parts of APAC is still ahead of some parts of Europe. For example, you can look at Australia, you can look at China, for example. China is doing great stuff on AI, right? I mean, both from an enterprise adoption of AI as well as from fundamental foundational model development perspective. China is doing way ahead of any European country, right? It's so much so that there is a roaring debate on who's better, US or China, which has, if you compare to the last fundamental disruption we saw, like the internet, there was no debate like this, right? But when it comes to AI, there is now this debate, right? So there are pockets of places where APAC is leading in terms of innovation as well as adoption. And there are some which, of course, the West is leading. So we are seeing an interesting sort of spread here. Yeah.
And also, I think APAC is quite big, but I thought it was very insightful what you just shared with us on the enterprises adopting AI and where they are on that maturity curve. And you were also mentioning, the more, let's say, advanced enterprises that are sort of like looking into integrating, adapting workflows to like really make use of AI. They're also having KPIs, or they're measuring sort of the return on investment. Can you share a little bit more on how to do it? Because I do believe that that's really challenging for a lot of companies.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think we can start. So ROI is a great. That is where things starts to get very, very tricky. And that's where, again, you need a consultant to come in and really help you sort of, design a framework, perhaps, which you can then operationalize and put all of your AI use cases through. The challenging bit on ROI from AI, right, is this. There are 2 or 3 things which are challenging. Firstly, you need to be able to attach the right value driver to the right AI use case. It sounds very simple, right? Oh, well, there is an AI use case which is reducing my human manpower time. Therefore, productivity is an obvious one. How much do I pay these people? Maybe $30,000 a year. If we are reducing 10%, $3,000 a year. It's not that simple. That kind of value driver attachment to an AI use case is no longer, productivity is table stakes. It's no longer a competitive differentiator, right? Everyone is playing the productivity game. You need to find the level 2 KPI value driver that is going to be coming as a result of that initial value driver that you think is going to be the primary one. And I'll give you an example, right? For a large bank, which shall go unnamed, of course, headquartered out of the UK, large presence in Singapore, they had this massive use case in their middle office in which we were seeing that there was a huge amount of manpower being spent to analyze contracts between lending contracts between the bank and large enterprises. So imagine a bank has about 100,000 customers in the enterprise lending space, like big enterprises, like NTUC, for example, or Singtel, right? Not saying that these are customers of this bank, but they have 100,000 such enterprises, right? And each enterprise, of course, is going to sign their lending contract with this bank on their own paper, right? Because they are such large enterprises. So you have 100,000 enterprises with 100,000 different contracts, all negotiated a couple of like 10, 15 times, who have sent you 20 different types of documents, and there are 100 documents. So per customer, right? So it becomes a multi-million document problem very, very soon. And what we ended up realizing was that to do downstream risk-based calculations, like the middle office was spending about there was 540 touch points every 6 months across these documents, which we thought that, okay, this can be reduced using GenAI for sure. And we said, all right, we'll design a GenAI solution which will be able to read through all these million documents. It will be a RAG-based solution. That time it was the horses book courses policy was not that popular, right? And it'll extract the information downstream, and therefore you could do the calculations. It will save about 30% in manpower costs, right? When we started to peel the layer of the onion a little bit more to do the value driver assignment to this use case, we realized that because of over dependency on human manpower, their risk-weighted asset calculation was completely off the charts. They were overestimating their RWAs by about a couple of $1 billion a month, right? Which now suddenly became a productivity use case, suddenly became a multi-billion-dollar use case. And if you solve that using GenAI, there would be a direct injection of dollars to your bottom line, not only your top line. Because if your RWA is inflated, you're keeping more cash reserves to support that large amount of risk-weighted assets. If you reduce the RWA, immediately you can release that cash reserves, get injected into the bottom line. This is a very, very tricky thing to do. That's the first trick. You have to assign the right value driver to the right use case, right? While productivity could be the first, the block to fall, the others are probably going to be much larger impact. So that's the first one. The second most tricky part is, how do you attribute what you're seeing in your business, the value that you're seeing in your business? How could you attribute it to your AI? It could be because of some extenuating factors, right? A guy who is defaulted on his loan could simply be taking advantage of the debt moratorium provided by the regulator because of some extreme situation, let's say.
I guess what you're saying is KPIs tend to be very like customized to the organization, but essentially it should go one level deeper rather than just to like calculate your
That's the first part, right? The second part is attribution. How do you attribute what you're noticing in your business to your AI use case?
It's probably more art than science in this case, right?
There are techniques to do that, right? So there are about 5 or 6 different techniques that you can use to attribute your value to your AI use case, right? If you solve these 2 things, to your question of how do you do this, Chris, you have solved 90% of the problem. The remaining 10% is about how do you do it on an ongoing basis, what kind of organizational structures you need to create in order for you to do it continuously. And once you do that, how do you then, persist it? And that persistence then comes to, okay, we can persist it as an asset on your balance sheet. Yeah. So that's the ROI question.
Super, super interesting. And just with an eye on time, I think the other thing that we also just touched upon, which I also want to ladder in, is obviously China. And China actually released their own, let's say, governance paper on like how they want to treat AI. And essentially, what I'm gathering from this is really it's about open source. I think all the models in China have been open source, and it's actually quite ironic if you think about it that the US is actually trying to really like clamp down, being very secretively, being very limiting. What do you think? Or a really good question here would be, China's cooperative AI stance. Do you think it's visionary? Do you think it's geopolitically inspired? Do they want to just like brush the image? What do you think about that?
So in my mind, anything that China is doing right now is heavily geopolitically uh, motivated. And rightfully so. It realizes that it's got a right to play at the world stage, and probably have to become the preeminent superpower of the world. And where it is the open source play, where it is coming from, is very, very interesting in my opinion. If you compare, I think I made a point about this earlier. If you compare it if you compare the AI wave to the internet wave, right, which was probably the last comparable massive disruptive wave in our generation, people were not talking about China. US laid the rules, right? US laid the rules, it created the markets and benefited the most from it, right? China very quickly realized that if you create the rules, if you are the rule maker, you are the market maker as well, right? So if you look at the World AI Conference, which came out in early 2025, rolled out by China, China was the first in about 2022 or 2023 enforce some regulations about recommendation engines, which is now, of course, EU AI Act has come out and followed suit and so on. They realized that US, what it's not doing is laying out a framework which the world can adopt, which is the open source framework, and that's what China is doing now. So China has very quickly realized that if you are the rule maker in sort of a framework that the majority of the population can adopt, you're going to become the market maker as well, and therefore by default you're going to become the leader. So, and therefore I think in that matter it's extremely visionary what China has done, right? The game is going to be open source.
Adi, bring that back to the region. So here, Southeast Asia, for example, it is a region that has to somehow like try to sit between two chairs. On one side, so China as this very influential, very powerful, very relevant neighbor with a lot of like trade with the whole region. Of course, also the US, right? So for a security guarantor and also like the traditional ally of all these countries in Southeast Asia. And when we think about AI, so often, for example, large organizations, they say, we won't implement Chinese models because of security concerns and so on. And this is more or less like on the Western world side. But what about Southeast Asia? Whenever a company comes to you and say, hey, I'd like to start doing some AI, do you also look into Chinese models, or do you take only US models or maybe like European models, or you're free to choose whatever is best? How do you decide here? What are the considerations?
So a lot of these considerations, the limitation factor is actually regulation, right? The limiting factor is regulation. When it comes to choice, you have a lot of choices right now, right? Typically, the open source models is going to be 4 times at least cheaper than your proprietary models, right? They're going to be much more customizable, right? The Alibaba models that Chris started off by mentioning, they cost about $2 to $3 per million token to customize, right? The OpenAI models, they cost about $10 per million token to customize or to fine tune, right? So the Chinese models, much cheaper right now, right? If you classify Alibaba as a Chinese model, and it's open source, so you can download, you can ring fence it, deploy it on your GPU stack, right? So for that matter, the regional companies who are ahead in their game are looking to get a cheaper horses for courses option. They're obviously going towards the much cheaper models, which are going to be the case, and that's provided by the open source world. And in the region, China is the biggest provider of the open source models in my opinion. Of course, a lot of open source models are coming in from Europe and the US and all that stuff. You mentioned the German models, which are not truly open source, if I know correctly, right? So in that matter, organizations right now who are not in completely affected by regulations are still going to go for the cheaper models, which are open source models, most of them provided by China. The Alibaba models are very accurate. Some of them are beating GPT-4o and even O4 Mini or Gemini 2.5, right? So there is some of them stand no debate actually. Yeah.
And Adi, do you hear a lot of like concerns on, oh, it's a Chinese model or something like that? That's at least something we hear quite a bit in Europe and the US.
As I said, because the region is becoming so cost conscious on AI, intelligent CIOs are starting to realize that the total cost of ownership of AI is not trivial, right? You cannot just roll out, I have got a co-pilot for everyone policy, right? It's not going to work anymore. You've got to really understand what's the ROI, how much you're spending on AI. So intelligent CIOs in the region are becoming very cost conscious. And if the regulation doesn't prevent them to be open source models, which they think they can ring fence and put them inside their on-prem infrastructure and build security guardrails around it, they are going for it. That's no longer a concern. But of course, if people don't know better, right, they're not focused on cost. They're just rolling out a co-pilot for everyone thing. They're doing it because of ignorance, right?
So you say that the cost factor is trumping the security data privacy concern that a company might have. And so here, especially, very often it is that you have large multinationals, and therefore APAC or Southeast Asia is just one region, is maybe they just one. So here, one specific some subsidiary segment of the whole organization. In those cases, what happens here? So is it so that there is like a global policy that say we are all taking OpenAI models, or they say, hey, no, here in Southeast Asia, we do not have the same concerns as, let's say, for our Canadian branch, and therefore here we can take some Chinese model from Alibaba, for example.
This is where an enterprise-wide AI strategy becomes very important, right? Now, if you are majorly headquartered in the US and you are governed by the US laws, for example, the US Cloud Act, for example, which was updated just 6 months ago, you are regulatory bound to not use any Chinese LLMs, right? Regulatory bound, right? And if you don't have an enterprise-wide AI strategy, your business, your Southeast Asian arm might as well be using it because you don't have an enterprise-wide AI strategy which says you cannot use any China models. Regardless, if you are able to, as I said, because a lot of this is open source, you can literally download that model and host it on-prem on your infrastructure like you would have downloaded any software, right? Now, if you have the the CISO capabilities, which is the Chief Information Security Office's capabilities, to do the right penetration testing of the downloaded model, and you have done the security testing, etc., and you found no glaring vulnerabilities, the regional companies are going ahead and using those models because they are much cheaper. But those companies which have an enterprise AI policy and they say that I'm restricted to use it because of certain regulation or because I'm going to lose some competitive advantage, those companies are now starting to to of course, be restricted towards that, even in the Asian counterparts.
Very interesting. And you were mentioning at the end of the day, it's really about organizations and people having an AI strategy and being sort of knowing where in their CEO agenda AI really sits. And of course, I mean, BCG also says 70% of a new technology adoption really comes from people and organizations and, maybe their openness and their understanding of it. And I think at least my experience so far is a lot of people either think AI can solve everything or they are a little bit afraid of it because they don't understand it. What's your perspective and your experience around that? And, how do you think managers can smart themselves up, or like how does an organization, or how should an organization actually approach this?
That's an interesting one, right? I mean, I often see that the grassroots worker or the analysts of the world, they are actually far ahead of AI adoption than the enterprise itself, if you know what I mean. So everyone in your enterprise, my consultants, are using ChatGPT on their phone, right? Like if most organizations, their employees are using. So a lot of the innovation in enterprise when it comes to AI is being driven by the grassroots. I was pleasantly surprised. I think last year there was a law firm in Europe. I forget the name now, VWA or something. I can send you the name later. They basically commissioned their paralegals to run a project which ran AI adoption for the enterprise, right? And they completely transformed their business because of that project, which was run by their paralegals, right? And now they are saving some 80% of cost. I mean, law firms are disrupted anyway, right? So definitely the innovation, in my opinion, is starting from the grassroots. Organizations which are able to create that mindset shift amongst their leaders and amongst the organizations are able to capture this innovation which is happening at grassroots, institutionalize it, aggregate it, and do the transformation of the personas, their workforce, and do a sort of strategic workforce planning across that, right? So that's how organizations are succeeding, in my opinion, anyway.
I think, Rod, that also answers your question on why consultants still exist in this world with AI and automation now. Cool. Just with an eye on time, I really would love to do a rapid fire on a couple of questions. And if you can be brief in your explanations, I think that would be really great. Or what is the most underrated AI startup that you have come across? Maybe AI startup or tool?
Underrated AI startup. I came across a startup called Aswa AI, out of India. It's a small startup. I think it's maybe raised about $8 million. But you know what they do? They do generative engine optimization. You remember good old search engine optimization when you're searching something in Google and your brand pops up? People are using ChatGPT now more than good old Google, right? You you take out your phone and you ChatGPT something, right? This company is trying to optimize brand presence on the responses, especially for free ones. That's an interesting.
Super AI conference. I don't know if you've been, Adi, but Ben Evans was speaking, and there was one slide that he showed, which is essentially LLMs are commodities. LLMs, like all the models, are commodities. There's only one LLM that succeeded to create a brand, and that's ChatGPT. None of the other ones. So maybe with that Indian startup, they can actually try to build up some brand awareness on the other models. Cool. What is one AI you're tired of hearing about?
Tired of hearing about. Co-pilots, man. If I hear the word co-pilot again. Co-pilots, I mean, you see the thing co-pilot is, it's not the ROI of co-pilot is not fundamentally proven. It's not very, very well proven, right? And how do you make sure that your co-pilots are really, really helping your employees without fundamentally breaking any of your governance and privacy policies and so on? The thing is that you will enter this everything as a co-pilot kind of a paradigm, right? Which is a death knell. It really is, right? It's endless chat assistance, which it will never really reach any ROI, right? companies who are able to sort of move away from this co-pilot thing into workflow transformation are the ones who are succeeding.
And talking about policies, what do you think is the most urgent AI policy concern?
I think automated disinformation, right?
Automated disinformation.
Yeah, automated disinformation, right? You are able to create an engine which could automatically put out disinformation for you on your behalf. And this is, of course, if you extrapolate it, this has got national concerns and geopolitical concerns and all of that stuff, right? I think that is the most urgent AI policy concern.
Actually, that reminds me of this one chatbot answer from, I think, Air Canada that actually granted a customer, because they complained, some discount or whatnot. And then I think Air Canada didn't want to pay for it. And then they actually went to court, and the passenger actually won because, again, the AI said so, right? And it was disguised as the customer service. So yeah, I think quite right. Maybe another question: what should enterprise leaders focus on when it comes to AI?
Enterprise leaders, are you talking about CEOs or technology leaders within enterprise, or brutal focus on how much money should you spend on AI and what is it getting you? Brutal focus on that.
And in one word, describe the future of enterprise AI.
In one word, describe the future of enterprise AI. Enterprise AI. Composable. Like Legos, like Lego blocks, right?
Modular.
Yeah,
Modular. Yeah, composable, right?
I like that.
Yeah. So winning stacks will be like Lego blocks. You'll have models, you have agents, you have RAG, you have guardrails, you have many models in your repository, and you can arrange it or rearrange it as and when you fit as when the enterprise changes.
Really cool. Adi, we spoke about a couple of topics today, but I feel like we could also sit here another 6 hours and talk about it. But we spoke about enterprise AI here in Asia. We spoke about, you told us or shared with us a couple of personas within that enterprise space. We spoke about return on investment, which is very important. We also touched upon China's open source strategy when it comes to AI. And we also grilled you on some of these prompt questions. Do you have any other, last thoughts you want to share with us and with the audience?
Oh, well, I think we are entering a very interesting era of development in AI. We are going to see across the three fundamental components of technology, which is the model, compute, and data storage, right? These are the three components which make any application in AI right now. We are seeing some fundamental developments which are making each of these three components lighter, more usable, more affordable, more democratized. Yes, we are seeing the rise of multi-agent systems. We are going to therefore see a proliferation of human out of the loop, workflows, which doesn't necessarily translate into job losses, right? This is the myth that I want to bust, right? Human out of the loop workflows doesn't necessarily transform into job losses. If you have a forward-looking CEO, you're starting to think of a skills-based organization versus a jobs-based organization. But regardless, the technology of AI is here to stay. It's going to enter a very exciting phase of adoption and development. And I encourage everyone who is not currently using it, start to use it either in your day-to-day life or your day-to-day work, because AI is not going to replace humans, the old saying, right? It will replace the humans which are not using AI, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm sure I got that quotation wrong.
Pilots, right? For
Oh,
us.
God. Copilot. Oh, that word.
I mean, this was super fun. If people wanted to reach out to you, how would they do that?
I'm on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, perhaps. Yeah, Aditya Shankar, Singapore. That's the best way to reach me. Yeah.
Amazing. Cool. Then thank you so much for all the insights. Really cool and very interesting conversation. And for those that really liked this episode, please always subscribe, comment, and feedback. We would love to hear from you. So on to next week.
All right. Cheers, guys. Real pleasure.